Hey folks, and welcome to They Might Be Homesteading. Today we're going to be making blackberry jam. Now, you can see that I've got all of these little blister packs in front of me. Recently, this week, they went on sale for 99 cents a piece. One of the dilemmas of living where we live in Phoenix is that there simply is not the berry picking that you can do in other parts of the country. So, we wait for this stuff to get on sale, and then what we do is, buy as much of it as we can and make up what we can. So right now, the first thing I'm doing is going through the clamshells and checking to make sure all the berries are good. There's no mold or anything on them. When you buy store-bought stuff like this, they will go to mold very quickly. What we like to do, or what I prefer to do, is that periodically all the different berries, whether they're strawberries, raspberries, blackberries, etc., will at some point in time during the summer go on sale for 99 cents a piece, and that's about as cheap as they get. So that is the perfect time to pick them up to make jam. Now, so far so good. And the nice thing about this, or when you're fresh picking, is that should you wind up buying or processing too much fruit, you can do what we do here, which is freeze the extras into ice cubes and then use them to make smoothies. Because we're big fans of the smoothie around here. The kids love them, my wife loves them, and I love them, and making them in the winter is kind of cost prohibitive. So I'm working up to a pretty good big bowl of berries here. And there we go. And don't forget, of course, to appropriately recycle all of this stuff when you're done. It looks like somebody hit my stockpile of berries in the middle of the night. Nicked a few. So we'll get the last of these in there. Now, with all fruits and foods that you want to process, you want to make sure that they've been given a good wash. So here we got, just putting them in the sink, quick spray off. You want to move them around a little bit so that they make sure that you get everything all well and rinsed. And one of the downsides of blackberries is they have great big seeds in them. So, in order to deal with this particular dilemma, we here have our food mill. And so these food mills, this particular one is a Vittorio food mill, but basically speaking, what it allows you to do is process food down to the necessary condition for doing whatever type of cooking you're doing. Say you're making your own tomato sauce, or in this case, you're canning berries. Now, the one thing you want to do is make sure not to overfill the basin. And so, this basin has a slanted side, and I prefer to fill it right to the edges of that slanted side and just continuously refill. There are also different screens for these, so depending on what you're milling will specify what to use as a screen. I've got my berry screen in here because we're doing berries. We went ahead and got the extra kit, so it's got a apple/tomato screen and a number of other screens. It only cranks one way, and basically it's a simple worm drive that will eventually push the berry remains out here, while the berry juice and the stuff we want drops down this panel directly into the bowl. Now, if you have children and convince them to be part of the process of this, this is an awesome job to give kids. It's kind of messy. The berry guts are kind of gross. They like it. Plus, it saves you from sitting here and having to crank until you're done. And so what I will do is show you very quickly. So here you can see the seeds and the rest of the stuff we don't want. In this bowl down here you can see the juice. And what I'm going to do is go ahead and finish processing all of these berries. This is going to take me a little bit and it's kind of boring to watch. So we're basically done with the berries now. Now one thing I've learned is that with the screws, the way they are in the bottom of these food mills, is that it's quite often the case where you get a little bit of food, berries or what have you, trapped behind the screw. And so what I like to do is just sort of take a chopstick and just sort of help those guys get into the thread. Now, even though you're not seeing anything down at the bottom here, your food has to process across this entire length here. So even though you're technically done adding and you can't see anything more, you still have a ways to go. And the easiest way to figure this out is basically when you stop seeing the leftover waste bits moving forward, then it's time to stop because it's pushed everything through. Now, in regards to these waste bits, a lot of folks, if you're a composter, because this is completely full of seeds, you cannot compost it. Otherwise, you'll have blackberries growing all over the place. Now, the positive to this is if you have a place on your property or a spot where you can grow blackberries or raspberries, whatever fruit you have, basically take this paste, spread it over the ground, throw some dirt over it. Hopefully next year you will have your own berries. Now, despite the quality that the food mill does do, I just throw it off into one last quick strain, and the goal of this is just to make absolutely certain that we haven't missed any last bits. And you may have to assist the stuff through the strainer. I take a wooden spoon, just run it back and forth, and basically what you're going to do is you're just going to push through the last bits. But at this stage, once all of this push is done, you have processed your berries. So it's about time to make jam. Now one of the nice things about making jam is when you're first getting started canning, it's basically the simplest thing you can make. It's berries, sugar, and pectin, and that's about it. So it allows you to work on your skills with the canner and just basically boiling and dealing with this stuff. But otherwise it's about as straightforward as you can get. So I'm going to finish and clean this up and we will move on to the next stage. So right now we're getting ready for the canning phase. I have my canning pot heating up on the stove behind me. We have some distinct challenges in our kitchen because we have an old stove with only one large burner, and for the jam making process you need at least two, so it's a bit of a juggling act. But while that's heating up, I wanted to show you sort of the weapons of canning. So you have your pot with a rack inside of it that allows you to immerse your jars. Your basic canning jar is a jar. This happens to be an 800 milliliter one. These are the small jam jars. And then there is a ring, and there is a seal. Now the nice thing is the rings and the jars are reusable. The seals you have to replace each time you do some canning. Now when it comes to actually doing the canning, this here is used to grab the hot jars in and out of the pot. They are exceptionally hot. You start out at 180 degrees Fahrenheit, so having one of these is very, very handy. These funnels are designed explicitly for the canning jars. They fit right in the top, and they're extremely handy when you're doing your filling. This little guy here, I'd never seen one of these until recently. These are a little magnet on a stick. It allows you to pull your hot lid, because you have to heat the lid and the glass, out of the water without burning yourself and allow you to set it in place. And then this guy here is all about headspace. Now headspace is a very specific term. When you look at any given recipe, it will tell you the amount of headspace that's necessary. And on this one, it has headspace measured in 1/4 inch increments. So to determine you have the correct headspace, you set this down on here, and that's set for a 1/4 inch of headspace, 1/2 inch, 3/4 of an inch, or an inch. And headspace is necessary because when you process or you boil the jars, the contents of the jar expands. And if you have too much inside the jar, what will happen is it will expand past the jar into the water, and your jar won't seal correctly. The last item you need is some form of temperature gauge. This little guy is just a very basic little digital thermometer. Because you're dealing with temperatures from a Fahrenheit range of 180 to 240, you have to check which one you buy and make sure it's the right type and the right scale. Because we will use this to measure the temperatures of the water both while we're heating the jars, but also as we are processing or boiling them. The other thing that you need to account for, I might as well mention it now, is your altitude. For every roughly 1,000 feet above sea level, you do need to add time to your processing. So this jam recipe requires 15 minutes of processing. Now, because we are more than 1,000 feet above sea level, we need to add 5 minutes to that, which makes it 20 minutes. So that's still heating up. Let's go ahead and move this stuff aside for right now, and we will start mixing up the jam. Now, as I said, jam itself is an extraordinarily simple recipe. Got a big pot, and if you try to use a smaller pot, you will learn the hard way because the jam tends to bubble up, and you will make a big mess of your stoves. So take my recommendation, nice tall pot. So this particular recipe requires 6½ cups of sugar. And you will learn very rapidly to shop for sugar sales when you start doing a bunch of this stuff, because sugar is not necessarily cheap in volume, but you do need a lot of it. So I like to put the sugar in first. 2, 3, 4, 5, 6.5. And this particular recipe also calls for 4 cups of berries. So, set that there for right now. Go ahead and pour off 4 cups. Now remember, this is a jam, not a jelly, so there's supposed to be bits of food in here. Jellies are clear, jams have kind of fruit meat in them. So there's the first 2 cups. Here's the next 2 cups. Now, as I said, we always end up processing a little extra here because we use it in other places. You'll see in the bottom of my bowl, I still have roughly 1.5 cups. So I can take it, put it in freezer trays, and freeze it for smoothies. If you add a little sugar to it and heat it up, you can turn it into a glaze for food. If you go searching on the internet, you'll find a whole bunch of other recipes. But basically, even before I put it on the heat, get it stirred up. You want to get the berries and the sugar nicely mixed. And you want to do this now before you put it on the heat so you don't accidentally scald or burn the sugar on the bottom, because you do need to bring this to a boil. And the other thing it does is it ensures you get a good sugar mixture all the way across. Now, as I said, we have an ancient stove here. I can barely hear the water heating up, so we're going to take a little break and wait for that to heat up. And then what we're going to do is we're going to put this on the stove. We're going to bring it to a boil, and then we're going to add pectin. Now, pectin comes in these little pouches, and one of the tricks that I like to do is you take a cup, either a measuring cup or a coffee mug that's larger than your envelope. You fill this with hot water, and what that does is it makes sure that the pectin, which is a syrup, flows out of the package and you get all of it. So for right now, I'm going to take a break, and when everything gets to be boiling, we will come back and show you the next step. So we put our jam on the stove, we raised it to a boil. I've got my pectin in here, and basically it needs to be a boil that you can't knock down by stirring. Now you take your pectin, dump the package in. As I said, I'd heated the pectin with hot water to make it flow better. The boil will immediately stop. Now this part I found is if you can get a third hand to assist, makes life a lot easier. So, and what will happen is you'll bring it back up for about a minute. And what the pectin does is it allows the jam to gel. So we're going to stir this for a little bit more. We have all our jars and our lids ready, so we're going to, the second this is ready, we're going to pull it off, set it on a trivet so it's off the stove, and we will start actually putting the jam into jars. Now immediately after pulling the jam off, you will see a foamy layer of, for lack of a better term, scum up here on the top of your jam. You need to spoon that off. Now what I do is I take a kind of a large old spoon and just sort of bend it in half, and that seems to make a pretty good scooper. And if you actually let the pot set for about 30 seconds, the stuff congeals up a little bit and makes it easier to scoop it out. Now this is basically a byproduct of the boiling and adding pectin process. There's also nothing wrong with this. You can eat it. One of the things I like to do is basically once I'm done is sit down with a cup of coffee, a box of saltines, and just sort of scoop this up. That's what I did when I was a kid, minus the coffee. Now, you don't have to be perfect with this, but you got to get most of it. Okay, so at this point, we've scooped all that off. We'll get that out of the way. And now we're ready to put it in jars. So open up my canner, and I've got my nice, hot jars waiting for me. I also have a separate smaller pan with my hot lids waiting for me. So now we start using the tools I mentioned earlier. The first thing we're going to do is grab a jar out, set the funnel in place, and I just use a basic ladle. I'm going to ladle it into the jars. Now this stuff requires basically a 1/4 inch of headspace. So what you do then is get it filled up. Get your headspace tool. Measure out your 1/4 inch all the way around. You also want to look for air bubbles and such. Air bubbles won't necessarily kill it, but they're not necessarily attractive. You need to make sure this will seal correctly. So use a wet rag or towel and wipe off the rim. Grab your lid with your magnetic tool, set it in place. Take one of your sealing rings. This basically needs to be just hand tight. And then grab your tongs, drop this back in the pot on the rack. And so now we're going to repeat this process. So now we got all of our cans in the water bath. The jars all in the water bath. They're raised up, so we want to lower them down. They need to be submerged by at least about 1 inch of water. Throw the lid on there, and what you need to do is get this to a roiling boil, or about 240 degrees. As soon as you can get it up to that temperature, you want to set your timer. Now, as I said, with our altitude and such, we're going to set this for 20 minutes. And then once 20 minutes is done, we're going to pull all the jars out and set them out to cool. So our processing time has completed, and it's time to pull the jars out. Now, I misquoted the temperature before. I said 240. It's supposed to be 220. My brain was not operating at full capacity. If you are graceful enough to do this, you can lift the rack up, which makes the jams much easier to grab. I got lucky this time. More often than not, I just tip all the jam jars over, which is not a good thing. And you just basically pull them out, and as they will cool, provided that they're sealing correctly, you will hear an audible tink from each one of the jars. That is the vacuum seal of the inner lid sucking down against the jar. It's one of those things that we kind of sit and wait for as we're doing it. So at this stage of the game, if you've been following along at home doing this, you've made your first batch jam. In fact, did you hear that click? There goes another one. That's 2 that's sealed up. We now have 7 jars of blackberry jam, and we're done. So now it's just a matter of getting a little bread and butter and cracking one open and eating it. So until next time, have a good one.